Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit today about sanding, just the whole concept of sanding. It's not as simple as you might think, nor is it as complicated as you think. But there is specific ways that if you use them, you'll wind up with a much better finish on your projects. There's a great deal of misconceptions with sanding every semester in all the classes that I teach. One of the biggest headaches that students have is trying to get all of the scratches out of their work. And quite often it's because they simply don't understand exactly how sandpaper works. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We'll use a random orbital sander just for the demonstration, but the concept that we're going to talk about applies to any kind of sander, even hand sanding. Sandpaper, by its very nature, has different size grit on the paper. You can go down, there are some sanding sheets and belts that go all the way down to 36 grit. In the woodworking world, generally 60 is the coarsest sandpaper that we would use. And even that is not used that often. It usually starts at 80. And it goes up to as high as 400. There's really no reason to go above 400 in sanding. And a lot of times you don't even need to go that high. But we'll talk about that as we go along. But because this is, I call this 80 grit sandpaper, the grit size is, of course, bigger than a 120 grit, which is bigger than a 220 grit, which is bigger than a 400 grit. Sandpaper is not intended for a lot of stock removal. You use other tools for that. If your piece of wood is too thick, you run it through the planer or the thickness sanders, the dual drum sander or the single drum. But by the time you get down to sanding with a random orbital, it should be flat and it should be fairly smooth. We normally run 80 grit on the thickness sanders. So, but we'll talk a little bit about grit, but what we're going to talk mostly about is scratches. Every piece of sandpaper puts scratches in the wood. The higher the grit, the smaller the scratches. But it's the scratches that we're dealing with. It's the scratches that we're trying to get out. Now, this board that I've got in front of me went through the thickness sander with 80 grit. Now, because it went through a drum sander, all of the scratches are long and parallel. They run the entire length of the board, and they're parallel to one another because it was cut on a drum. So, if this is 80 grit, the next grit down would be 120. So if we start with 120 on the random orbital, what we want to do is sand this board until we get all of these 80 grit scratches out. Now, you know they're out when you can hold the board up, get it turned in the light just right, and you don't see any of the long parallel scratches. But you've got to actually look for them. And the best way to do it is to get in as bright a light as you can and turn it at different angles until you get exactly the right reflection on it from the light to show the scratches. They're not always easy to see, but to make it easier on yourself, you need to find a way that works for you, where you know for sure that you've gotten all of these scratches out. You can't just say, okay, 3 minutes or 30 different strokes on it, and I'm done. and I change grits. No, you go until the scratches are out. And the only way that you know that they're out is to pick the board up and inspect it and look for them. And when you're sure that they're gone, then you go to the next grit. Now, the only thing you're going to do, say we started with 120 grit, and we took out the 80 grit scratches that were left by the drum sanders. All we're trying to do with the 120 grit is to sand out the 80 grit scratches that were already there. But in taking out those 80 grit scratches, this 120 grit pad is going to put 120 grit scratches in your wood. There will be scratches in this wood. They will be smaller than the 80 grit, but they will be there. So once you're sure that you've got all of the 80 grit scratches out, then you're done with the 120 grit. The next step is to change to, say, the 220 grit. Now, the whole purpose of the 220 grit is not to remove any material. The whole purpose of switching to the 220 grit is to take out the 120 grit scratches that you left in the board. So you use the 220 grit until you take out use the 220 grit to take out the 120 grit scratches. And now when you get all of the 120 grit scratches out, you have still left 220 grit scratches. They're smaller, but they're still there. Now, the thing you need to understand about the grits, the scratches left by 220 grit can't be seen with most human eyes. If you get this board up and you really look at it, you won't see 220 grit scratches. You can see 120 and you can see 80, but the human eye can't see 220 grit scratches unaided. Now, if you get a magnifying glass, sure, you can see them. And depending on the type of finish that you're going to put on the piece, a lot of times 220 grit is as far as you need to go because you can't see the 220 grit scratches. For some projects and certain types of wood, then you would want to go a little finer. If you were going to put lacquer on it, 220 is all you need. But if you were going to buff it with a buffing system and end with wax, then you need to go to a 320, then a 400 before you put it on the buffer. But for most of the projects, especially the ones that we will be doing in here in the beginning class, 220 is as far as you need to go. Now, if you're an overachiever, we have the 320 and the 400 grit, and you can spend the time and do it if you want. But it's not going to make any difference in the final appearance of the piece. Now, the important thing, the takeaway from this lecture, is you need to get all of the scratches from the previous grit out before you quit. And if you were sanding with, say, 220 grit, and you're sanding along and you notice that there was one section right through here that still had some of the 80 grit scratches. You didn't take them all the way out. And you think, shoot, I'll just go ahead and do it with the 220. No, you won't. You can spend all day long trying to sand out 80 grit scratches with 220 grit, and it's just simply going to take you forever. If you see that you've still have the 80 grit straight scratches in here after you've gone to the 220 grit, take the 220 off, put the 120 back on, and then sand out those 80 grit scratches, and then come back and do your 220 sanding. You must, the only acceptable way to take out 80 grit scratches is with 120 grit paper. And if you discover later, deeper into the sanding process, that there's still some 80 grit scratches, then go back to the 120 paper and take those scratches out, and then go back and do your 220. But one of the biggest mistakes that students make in here is they spend way too much time with the finer grits. Because the smoother the board gets, the more the scratches will show up. And they'll see a scratch and they'll sit there with the 220 grit and they'll wear out 3 pads. And then they come to me complaining, I can't get this scratch out. Well, the reason they couldn't get it out is they were trying to remove an awful lot of material, trying to get that scratch out with fine grit sandpaper, and it just doesn't work that way. It's not designed to work that way. And I highly recommend that you spend a lot of time looking. Pick that board up and look at it. Put it at different angles so you can see that it's smooth. Sometimes a scratch that you can't see in the bare wood, as soon as you put a finish on it, that scratch will just jump out at you. So look really, really close and carefully to make sure that all of the scratches are gone before you put finish on it. Because once you put finish on it and scratches show up, you got 2 choices. You can either leave it, or you'll have to remove all of that finish and then sand those scratches out and refinish it. So as you go through the process, just simply make sure that all of the scratches are out from the previous grit before you switch to a higher grit. It's a simple concept, and if you follow it, it will make your sanding faster and easier, and your projects will simply look better. So, one other thing I will tell you, there is no substitute for experience when it comes to sanding. In the beginning, you will make mistakes. You will put finish on wood and say, oh, where did that scratch come from? Well, it'd been there all along and you missed it. But as you make the mistakes and see the downside of not sanding well, then it will encourage you to do a better job next time. And after you've done it for a while, then the sanding mistakes will get fewer and fewer. But it's all an experience driven thing, and there's just simply no substitute for it, and there's no easy way around it. Woodworking, like anything else that requires a little skill, you simply have to pay your dues. Make your mistakes, learn from them, correct them, and do it better next time. So that's about it for sanding, and we will look at a different topic on another day.